So shall we start? Yeah. Hello, everybody, and we want to welcome you to Cinema Politica Danforth's event, provocatively entitled Tax the Rich, Fair Taxation Will Make a Better Canada. I'm Jean Tischauer, and I'm co-chair with Gabriella Byron of the Toronto-Danforth NDP Writing Association Outreach Committee and the Cinema Politica Danforth series. This series has been going on for over 10 years in East Toronto as live screenings of important documentary films, followed by panel discussions and Q&As with experts and activists. But for the pandemic, we've needed to change our format to online events, focusing on a panel discussion of topical relevant issues, accompanied by some recommended films and other materials for you to view on your own if you wish to go deeper into the subject. Tonight, we are featuring an excellent panel to consider a subject which was discussed in the recent election, tax the rich. And we'll get started in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful for the opportunity to work and live on this land. We're going to get a lot of insight from our Tax the Rich theme from our panelists and moderator in a few minutes. But first of all, we'd like to keep a little cinema in Cinema Politica Danforth. So we've got a couple short films to whet your appetite on the subject. The first one, Robert Reich, who is former US Secretary of Labor, with a spooky Halloween-appropriate little film called 12 Biggest Myths About Taxes on the Rich. Let's roll that one.
Some politicians are calling for higher taxes on the rich. And naturally, these proposals have unleashed a torrent of opposition, mostly from the rich. Here are the 12 biggest myths they are propounding. Myth: a top marginal tax rate applies to all of a person's total income or wealth.
Why aren't you giving 70% of your income to the government? You could.
You're going to tax 70% of your paycheck.
Wrong. It would only apply to dollars in excess of a certain level. The 70% income tax rate proposed by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would apply only to dollars in excess of $10 million a year. The 2% wealth tax proposed by Elizabeth Warren would apply only to wealth in excess of $50 million. Myth: raising taxes on the rich is a far-left idea.
She wants to radically tax the rich.
Taxing rich people, that's an old saw from the left.
Baloney. 70% of Americans, including 54% of Republicans, support raising taxes on families making more than $10 million a year. And expecting the rich to pay their fair share is a traditional American idea. From 1930 to 1980, the average top marginal income tax rate was 78%. From 1951 to 1963, it exceeded 90%. Again, only on dollars in excess of a very high threshold. Even considering all deductions and tax credits, the very rich paid over half of their top incomes in taxes. Myth: a wealth tax is unconstitutional.
Bad idea.
And it's likely unconstitutional.
Sounds great. Not constitutional, I don't think.
Rubbish. Most locales already impose an annual wealth tax on the value of people's homes, the main source of household wealth for most people. It's called the property tax. The rich hold most of their wealth in stocks and bonds. So why should these forms of wealth escape taxation? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes. Myth: when taxes on the rich are cut, they invest more and everyone benefits. When taxes on the rich are increased, economic growth slows.
The frightening thing about high marginal tax rates is that it leads us into a low productivity economy.
They're going to stop creating jobs. If you raise the interest rates, they'll stop investing money. They'll stop borrowing money. And that has a trickle-down effect.
utter baloney. Trickle-down economics is a cruel joke. Donald Trump, George W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan all cut taxes on the rich, and nothing trickled down. There's no evidence that higher taxes on the rich slows economic growth. To the contrary, when the top marginal tax rate has been high, between 71 and 92%, growth has averaged 4% a year. But when the top rate has been low, between 28 and 39%, growth has averaged only 2.1%. Myth. When you cut taxes on corporations, they invest more and create more jobs.
Will stimulate investment domestically.
Stimulate the jobs that the economy needs.
Wrong again. After Trump and the Republicans lowered the corporate tax rate in 2018, America's largest corporations cut more jobs than they created. They used their tax savings largely to increase their stock prices by buying back their own shares of stock, enriching executives and wealthy investors, but providing no real benefit to the economy. Myth. The rich already pay more than their fair share in taxes.
When she says the thing about fair share, you know, the top 1% of earners pay 40% of income taxes.
The top 1% already pay 37% of all federal income taxes.
This is misleading because it focuses only on income taxes, leaving out the large and growing tax burden on lower income Americans. Payroll taxes, state and local sales taxes, and property taxes take bigger bites out of the pay of lower income families than higher income. Myth. The rich already pay capital gains taxes.
The very, very top pay capital gains tax.
We already have a 30%, 20 to 30% tax on capital gains.
Misleading. Rich families avoid paying capital gains taxes by passing their wealth on to their heirs. In fact, the largest share of big estates transferred from generation to generation are unrealized capital gains that have never been taxed. Myth. The estate tax is a death tax that hits millions of Americans.
Does death trigger another grab from the government? It's so un-American, it just turns my stomach. She wants another bite at the apple. And when you die, even another bite at the apple, 40% worth.
Baloney. The current estate tax, which only applies to assets in excess of $11 million or $22 million for couples, affects fewer than 2,000 families. Myth. If taxes are raised on the wealthy, they will find ways to evade them, so very little money is going to be raised.
Billionaires will go somewhere else. Multimillionaires will go somewhere else.
So you raise these taxes and people shift their investments to avoid higher taxes.
More rubbish. For example, a 2% wealth tax, as proposed by Senator Elizabeth Warren, would raise around $2.75 trillion over the next decade, with very little tax evasion, according to research. A 70% tax on incomes over $10 million would raise close to $720 billion over the next 10 years. Myth. The only reason to raise taxes on the wealthy is to collect revenue.
No one really believes that it would either bring in more revenues.
It's not just because you object to the existence of rich people. You're not trying to hurt them. You just want to pay for more stuff.
No. Although these proposals would generate lots of revenue and help us reduce the national debt while investing in schools, roads, and all the other things we need, another major purpose is to reduce inequality and thereby safeguard democracy against oligarchy. Myth. It's unfair to raise taxes on the wealthy.
Seems to me like it's more a debate about punishing the rich, about punishing success.
The most successful are not only paying their fair share, they're paying the most. Pay your fair share? What are you talking about?
Actually, it's unfair not to raise taxes on the rich. For the last 40 years, most Americans have seen almost no growth in their incomes at all, while the incomes of a minority at the top have skyrocketed. We're rapidly heading toward a society dominated by a handful of super rich, many of whom have never worked a day in their lives. More than 60% of wealth in America is now inherited. Myth. They earned it. It's their money.
I think if people earn money, they should be able to hold on to it.
And be able to do as they see fit with their newfound hard-earned cash.
Hogwash. It's their country, too. They couldn't maintain their fortunes without what America provides: national defense, police, laws, courts, political stability, and the Constitution. They couldn't have got where they are without other things America provides: education, infrastructure, and a nation that respects private property. And to argue it's their money also ignores a lot of other ways America has bestowed advantages on the rich. Everything from bailing out Wall Street bankers when they get into trouble to subsidizing the research of big pharma. So the next time you hear one of these myths, know the truth. If you found our video informative, please follow this page.
Okay. Well, pretty scary, huh? Everybody remember all of the myths? There'll be a test later. No, just kidding. Now, one of the biggest myths that Robert Reich mentioned is that raising taxes on the rich would make them unable to create jobs. Well, let's look at one of the wealthiest people in North America, Nick Hanauer, and see what he has to say about this in his short TED Talk, which we've shortened further a little bit so that we can get to our panel. So here we go.
It is astounding how significantly one idea can shape a society and its policies. Consider this one. If taxes on the rich go up, job creation will go down. This idea is an article of faith for Republicans and seldom challenged by Democrats, and has indeed shaped much of the economic landscape. But sometimes the ideas that we are certain are true are dead wrong. Consider that for thousands of years, humans believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. It's not, and an astronomer who still believed that it was would do some pretty terrible astronomy. Likewise, a policymaker who believes that the rich are job creators and therefore should not be taxed will do equally terrible policy. I have started or helped start dozens of companies and initially hired lots of people, but if there was no one around who could afford to buy what we had to sell, all those companies and all those jobs would have evaporated. That's why I can say with confidence that rich people don't create jobs, nor do businesses large or small. Jobs are a consequence of a circle of life-like feedback loop between customers and businesses. And only consumers can set in motion this virtuous cycle of increasing demand and hiring. In this sense, an ordinary consumer is more of a job creator than a capitalist like me. That's why when business people take credit for creating jobs, it's a little bit like squirrels taking credit for creating evolution. It's actually the other way around. Anyone who's ever run a business knows that hiring more people is a course of last resort for capitalists. It's what we do if and only if rising consumer demand requires it. And in this sense, calling ourselves job creators isn't just inaccurate, it's disingenuous. That's why our existing policies are so upside down. When the biggest tax exemptions and the lowest tax rates benefit the richest, all in the name of job creation, all that happens is that the rich get richer. Since 1980, the share of income for the top 1% of Americans has more than tripled, while our effective tax rates have gone down by 50%. If it was true that lower taxes for the rich and more wealth for the wealthy led to job creation, today we would be drowning in jobs. And thank you. Businesses. And when the middle class thrives, businesses grow and hire, and owners profit. That's why taxing the rich to pay for investments that benefit all is such a fantastic deal for the middle class and the rich. So, ladies and gentlemen, here's an idea worth spreading. In a capitalist economy, the true job creators are middle class consumers. And taxing the rich to make investments that make the middle class grow and thrive is the single shrewdest thing we can do for the middle class, for the poor, and for the rich. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a shock, right? Rich guy saying that we should raise his taxes. Okay, now we'd like to move on to the featured and most special part of the program tonight. And as we go along, by the way, everybody, I think you're already submitting some questions, and you're welcome to put them in the chat box, and we'll be dealing with as many as we can later on. But first of all, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Clare Hacksel. Clare is waving to us now, and she's very familiar to those of us here in Toronto-Danforth because she was our most recent candidate under the NDP banner for in the election last month. And we're very happy that Clare was with us in that regard, and I hope she stays with us for the next election. And we also want to tell you a little bit about Clare's background. She works in the healthcare field and is a lifelong activist and social justice warrior. She's a mother, as you can see, of one of her children in the lower part of the frame there. Hi there. And we'll turn it over to Clare now to introduce the panel and conduct the evening. Thank you very much, Clare.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us tonight. We've got a moderator assistant who's popped in. I'm going to be introducing our panelists one at a time and giving them each an opportunity to speak for 5 or 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a conversation afterwards. I've got some questions prepared, but really are keen to hear the questions and conversations from the audience. So please do type your questions into the chat, and Lucy and I will be consolidating them and making sure they are ready to go. So our first speaker is Toby Sanger, and Toby's Executive Director of Canadians for Tax Fairness. Toby has been widely respected Canadian economist for over 30 years, working previously as an economist for the Canadian Union of Public Employees, as a chief economist for the Yukon, as a principal economic advisor to the Ontario Ministry of Finance, as economic advisor to First Nations, and as an environmental economist. Prior to that, he also worked as a baker, in a circus, and as a journalist. And he lives in Ottawa. Over to you.
Great. I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks, first of all, for holding this. Thank you for inviting us, having it on this topic. And thank you in particular to all the participants. Wow, we've got over 100 people. That's fantastic. Really enthusiastic about that. I wanted to start off taking a bit of a longer view and then get into some specifics. It's great to have this. I mean, I recall when just, a dozen years ago, tax was considered a dirty word in politics, even among people sort of on our side. This was due to the extreme success of right-wing conservative and business lobby groups, in particular people like Grover Norquist, who founded Americans for Tax Reform about 35 years ago in 1985. He was successful at getting an astounding number, 98% of Republican Congress members and a number of Democrats to sign what he called a taxpayer protection pledge, which was to oppose any and all tax increases to the marginal income tax rates for individuals in business. And those are the most progressive taxes there, and also any net reduction in deductions and credits. He was also famous for saying, I'm not in favor of abolishing the government. I just want to shrink it down to the size where we can drown it in the bathtub. In Canada, this project was, of course, taken up the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Fraser Institute, C.D. Howe Institute, and at least half a dozen other right-wing research and business advocacy organizations, all bankrolled to the tune of millions of dollars by Canadian and U.S. wealthy and corporate interests. When we look at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, they have a budget of over $6 million a year. That's 20 times our budget, and they can be highly effective. So it got so bad that even progressives like environmentalists and also dear Jack Layton were scared of calling for tax increases or things like a carbon tax. environmentalists, and also in conversations I had with Jack Layton, said that didn't want to talk about a carbon tax, wanted to call it a carbon price, a duty, a levy, or a fee, but don't call for a carbon tax. And we had Prime Minister, we had Stephen Harper, who claimed he was an economist, but he said he thought that all taxes were bad taxes, which is an absolutely ridiculous thing for an economist to say. So, and under Harper, it became quickly apparent that unless you were advocating for a tax cut or a credit, there was no point in going into any pre-budget consultations with their government, because that's all they were interested in. And then Tom Mulcair was also very hesitant and opposed to calling for marginal income tax rate above 50%. So we've come a really long way in the past 10 years or so. Now, because tax was considered such a bad word and deficits considered even worse, this anti-tax propaganda severely constrained what we could do or even imagine that we could do as a society. As a result, during Harper's tenure, the federal government's revenues and spending as a share of the economy shrank to almost the lowest in 70 years. So that was lower than it was before we introduced CPP, before Medicare, and before a lot of other things that we now take for granted and depend on. Federal corporate tax rates were cut in half from, first of all, under Martin, and then continued under Harper from 1999 to 2015, and much lower than they were for much of the 20th century. The federal corporate tax rate now is 15%. There's about 10% for each of the provinces. It varies by province. During the 60s, it was over 40% and over 50%, including some of the provinces. And top marginal tax rates were also slashed. They were over 70% up until the 70s, and they'd even been above 90% during the 1940s, during the war period. So these taxes and taxes on investment and capital gains were also slashed, claiming that they would lead to increased investment, more economic growth, more jobs, higher wages, just as Robert Reich talked about. But nothing of the sort happened. Instead, we had lower rates of investment, wage stagnation, and increased inequality. So it's been a multi-$100 billion experiment that has simply failed. Now the tide is starting to turn. Even the Conservative government in the UK has pledged to increase corporate tax rates recently, as did US President Joe Biden. And it's also, it may be hard to believe now, but it's really only about a dozen years since trickle-down economics was so widely discredited in the mainstream as well. It's a decade since the Occupy Wall Street protests were held. And that's when our organization, Canadians for Tax Fairness, and also a number of other tax justice organizations were established. So we recognize that a progressive tax system is important for reducing inequalities, but it's also very important because it generates the revenue to pay for public services, which are an even more important poverty and inequality buster. A study that was done by Hugh McKenzie, who some of you may recognize, found that about 80% of Canadians get more in return from public services that their taxes pay for than they pay in taxes. So while the average Canadian tax freedom day may be in May or considerably early if you calculate correctly, the public services day, the dollar value of the public services that they pay taxes for, lands about in early August. So you're getting basically a few months of what should be considered kind of free services. And because public services are generally delivered more efficiently than private services, the real value of them is even greater. So to get to the questions, how can fair taxation make a better Canada, and what does it mean to tax the super wealthy? So our organization is focused on a few key areas. These include closing regressive tax loopholes like stock options, capital gains. These are mostly used by the rich. And you have to close those loopholes when you're raising the rate, or raising the rates isn't going to be effective. Tackling tax havens, Marco's going to talk in particular a bit more about those. Those are mostly used by wealthy individuals and large corporations, as we've seen. and large corporations have particularly benefited from tax shifting internationally, which has led to increased corporate concentration. It's not the Main Street businesses that have benefited from or take advantage of tax havens. Taxing the rich, including raising top rates and taxing wealth. Studies have been done that show that you could raise the top rate until about 70 or 80% by Lars Osberg and others, and it would still bring in more money. In fact, the recent increase that the Liberals brought in, there was no reduction in behavioral effect or elasticity in that way. Taxing wealth is incredibly important. Also, I don't know if many of you followed it, but there was a recent leak of IRS data to the ProPublica news service, in which it was revealed that some of the wealthiest people in the world paid no income tax in some years. So you need a wealth tax there as well. And over the past decade, the calculations that I've done have shown that it's only the top 1% that have increased their share of wealth. Making corporations pay their fair share, including the tech giants. That's another of our campaigns. Corporate individual wealth is very closely connected with corporate wealth as well, in a lot of ways, both among professionals who are able to take advantage of small businesses, but also at the very top. And then finally, making polluters pay. Well, making polluters pay, having higher taxes on greenhouse gas emissions, and then finally increasing the transparency of who owns what. If we don't have that information, then we don't know and we can't collect that money. So 2019 and also in this year's federal election, we've produced a detailed platform for tax fairness to detail what we would like parties to include in their election platforms. You can find this at our website at www.taxfairness.ca, and where you can sign up for our monthly newsletter and also be on our contact list. This has got details in areas that we've advocated for, and it may be a coincidence, but we seem to have been very successful. In the past two elections, the party platforms, especially that of the NDP, but also to some extent of the Greens and Bloc, have been by far the most progressive that I've seen for over 40 years in the federal political scene. The measures that we've proposed could raise approximately 90 billion or more annually. And my estimates tend to be on the cautious side. Invariably, the estimates from the PBO tend to be higher. I can go into details in terms of how much these different measures and what the specific measures could be, but they could raise a lot more than they could raise over 90 billion a year. And that could, of course, pay for a lot, including 10 billion for affordable, accessible childcare for everybody, 10 billion for free post-secondary education, university and college education, 15 billion for a national pharmacare program, and much, much more. So instead of having our noses stuck down on broken pavements, as Tommy Douglas used to say, we can and should dream no little dreams. And in the spirit of Tommy Douglas, we can pay for all these important public services with progressive taxes. It certainly isn't too late to build a better world. In fact, it's long past due that we should be doing so. Thank you, and sorry about going a bit long there.
That's okay, Toby. Anyone who wants to quote Tommy Douglas can go a little late, as far as I'm concerned.
You got to do it.
I am going to go over and introduce our next speaker. Let's make sure we got the spotlight on Katrina. Let's wait for that. Awesome, there we go. Okay, so Katrina Miller is the program director of the Broadbent Institute Tax the Rich campaign, and she's been driving the Institute's policy campaign and communications to build a progressive landscape in Canada. She has over 17 years of experience as communications and public policy strategist, working with a wide array of labor, community, and other non-governmental organizations to promote progressive social policy. She seeks to share knowledge through training activities and communication tactics and facilitating campaign and strategic planning. Katrina, it's so lovely to have you. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Claire. I really appreciate being here tonight. I always love watching those films. I've seen them both, and love speaking with Toby and Marco. Toby really talked about the policy landscape that shifted over that last decade, really, from where it's been for about 40 years. I'm going to talk about that same landscape from a human angle, because taxes, although that seems to be sort of the economist's bailiwick, for me, I really think of taxes as an essential part of our democracy. I mean, taxes are what we do to pay for the things we democratically decide we want to do together to build the kind of society we all want to live in together. So they really are quite essential. And it's been very frustrating as an activist and advocate. I'm sure I share this frustration with some people who are joined here in the audience tonight, to have gone through a couple of decades of my career without really being able to talk about that in a useful way. Most of those conversations were very negative, and the conversations that were positive, frankly, were amongst a very few of us policy geeks, like Toby remembers, who could dig into this idea of fair taxation with some sense of excitement, but couldn't find a foothold for that in the public. And so I want to talk about why that's shifted and when I started to see that shift. I started to see that shift when people started to understand the deepening wealth and income inequality in Canada, and started to understand the impact it was having on society. At the Broadbent Institute, we did some research about 6-7 years ago on Canadians' perceptions around wealth and the wealth gap, wealth inequality. And what we found was that Canadians grossly underestimated the level of wealth inequality. And when we told them how bad it was, we told them what the actual levels were, their immediate response was, the government has to do something about this. And one of the solutions that they were drawn towards was an idea of fair taxation, that the wealthy should be contributing more back into a society in order to help that society become more fair. Now, at this point in the conversation, 7 years ago or so, this was pretty still on a conceptual level. It was still fairly distant from people's lives and from what they thought about as their day-to-day sort of sense of well-being and prosperity. This really started to shift. I saw this shift in the data. I saw this shift in campaigns and conversations and in polling that we did in 2018 and 2019 that started to research the level of anxiety that Canadians were gathering around whether or not they could afford a decent life in Canada. This is at a time where we've had about a decade or so of stagnating wages and earnings for a lot of Canadians, while there is significant rising prices around housing, around some healthcare costs, around costs for medications, less and less coverage for those sorts of things through people's employment. So people were starting to hit this sort of affordability crunch. And in polling that we did in 2019, we saw, in fact, that a significant level of people were very anxious about whether or not they could afford a decent life and they would be able to continue affording a decent life. And along with that, they saw that taxation, that taxing corporations and the wealthy would actually be a way to help them have a more affordable life. In fact, 70% of them believed that. So at this point, this is where the issue starts to attach to people's everyday lives in a way that we had never seen before, that I had never seen before. And during COVID, that only grew. COVID showed us the deep cracks that affected each and every one of us in our lives, the cracks in our healthcare system, the cracks in our social support system, the cracks in our education system, so that our kids really couldn't get the quality education they needed during this pandemic. And stepping out of that very quickly, within just a few months, poll after poll showed that a majority of Canadians wanted us to develop a recovery plan that built a stronger, more equitable, more inclusive Canada. And they understood that that was a plan that was going to cost money. They understood that Canada was already spending a lot of money. And they also understood that austerity would just hurt us way, way more if that was the way we were going to pay for the cost of the pandemic and some sort of stimulus recovery that came out of the pandemic. And Canadians weren't the only ones who saw this. All the organizations working on issues like healthcare, like housing, education, truth and reconciliation, systemic racism, climate change being a really big one, also started to realize that they had to have, as part of their proposal, as part of their offer for bettering these things and these services, they had to actually have fair taxation as part of that, because they needed a way to pay for it. And they needed to provide Canadians with that assurance that there was a way to fund these things that we wanted together. So for the first time that I've ever seen and I've ever heard about in the last 50 years, climate activists, housing activists, anti-poverty activists all started coming around the table and saying, tax the rich. Now, Toby and I are involved in an actual formal campaign that's done this. It's been operating for about a year now, called Tax the Rich. Surprisingly, no, really. And that campaign has about 6 or 7 organizations on it. I really, I encourage you to go look at the website. It's letstaxtherich.ca. There's another few dozen organizations across civil society that signed on to a support statement right before the election, calling on the government to put forward a wealth tax, put forward a pandemic's profits tax, close a host of tax loopholes in the tax havens, not just because we're trying to be mean to the rich, but specifically because we desperately need to invest in a better society together. We desperately need to invest in a plan that addresses climate change. So there's a desperate need there. People understand that, and they understand that there is a way to pay for it in a way that they haven't understood before. Now, 9 in 10 Canadians support a wealth tax. 9 in 10 Canadians support closing the tax loopholes and taxing corporations more. That's a near consensus in Canada. So we're at a really, really critical time where we can actually trigger action on this in a way we haven't been able to in decades. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'm going to just move over and wait for Marco to be spotlighted. There we go. All right. So next up we have, I'm just checking the time. We've got lots of time. We're doing great. We have Marco Chown Oved, who's an investigative journalist and collaborator in producing the Panama Papers. Marco is an investigative reporter who works on database projects. He's part of the global journalism collaboration that produced and recently published hard-hitting Pandora Papers and previously the Panama Papers, writing reports that were recognized with a citation of merit at the 2016 Missioner Awards and the 2017 National Newspaper Award. His work has been nominated twice for both the Canadian Journalism Foundation's Jackman Award and the National Newspapers Award for Project of the Year. He was the recipient of the 2014 R. James Travis Foreign Corresponding Fellowship and traveled to Africa and Peru, reporting on the relationship between mining and foreign aid. Before joining the Star, Marco was widely traveled associate press foreign correspondent and worked for Radio France International in Paris. Marco?
Well, thank you very much, Claire, and thank you to everyone for making the time tonight to talk about such a riveting subject of taxation. It's a rare day that I hear 115 people now actually want to sit down and talk about tax. As Claire mentioned, I kind of came to the issue of taxation in a weird way. I came to it by being offered a giant trove of secret tax haven documents, and I knew nothing about tax. And part of that original reporting trip is I went to a tax haven, and my original thought was, well, we should just go down there, see what it's all about, talk to people. And to make a long story short, I landed on the tarmac in the British Virgin Islands, and they immediately arrested me, detained me, and put me on the first plane off the island. And I hadn't even asked the question yet. And I said, I got back, I was sitting in Puerto Rico trying to figure out how to get back to Canada. And I was like, what possibly would justify deporting a journalist, from a legitimate organization? I had interviews lined up with the governor of the island, but this speaks very precisely to the way tax havens work and as this kind of nexus of a lot of these problems that we've been bringing up around, that Katrina and Toby both spoke about. And if I was to sort of, we could talk about this for hours, but if I was to kind of hone in on one thing about it, tax havens really are the place where all this goes on. And this is not only the legitimate stuff that, people who've written the tax code have decided we're going to allow businesses to organize themselves in such a way that they can not pay taxes when they run it through a tax haven, and other ways where it's sort of creative interpretations of laws where, sure, if you don't really want to pay tax, there are ways of setting up Byzantine structures on far-flung islands so that not only you, but your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will never have to pay tax. And these things, what blew my mind as a layman who just kind of stumbled into this kind of stuff was most of it's legal. I couldn't believe it. Why would anyone in their right mind make this kind of stuff legal? It's so obvious from a layman's point of view to say, well, why would you want companies to have 10 other companies that they own, and then we've made rules that if this company hides money, they're on the hook, but all the other companies that are above it in the chain aren't on the hook. So it's this like way of kind of distancing yourself from bad behavior, and it's creating this kind of plausible deniability or this way of avoiding responsibility. And I mean, we've seen it with SNC-Lavalin. That is a perfect Canadian example where SNC-Lavalin has been busted on multiple occasions paying huge bribes all over the world. And how do they do it? Well, through tax haven companies. And you say, oh, I hired this tax haven company to consult for me, and they got a really big contract, and all that money went to a corrupt politician in a foreign country. And so these kind of stuff, I mean, obviously that is not legal, but the point is that the structure that it's set up for is totally legal. You can set up paper companies and then pay them millions of dollars for consulting services. That's legal. And so I think one of the things to sort of say, okay, I saw all these crazy things down there. I mean, we can go through the laundry list of prominent Canadians besides SNC-Lavalin. I mean, the Colbert and Bronfman families, who are the, power families behind the Liberal Party of Canada, had huge amounts of money in these offshore trusts. And the rules around offshore trusts are pretty simple. All you have to do is just say, I have an offshore trust. You don't have to pay tax on it. You just have to say you have it. And these guys hid it for decades. Why didn't you just say that you had it? You don't have to pay tax on it. But it speaks to the secrecy mindset that goes on there. And so much of the problem in tax havens could just simply be solved with a bit of sunlight. It's easy as a journalist. We always love shining sunlight on everything. Hey, we need more transparency, always the solution to everything. But in this case, it really is. In tax, for the example I think that Robert Reich used in his video about how we already tax wealth through property taxes. I use a very similar example when I talk about transparency in tax havens. I say, if you buy a condo in Toronto, you got to put your name on it. A lot of the abuses in tax havens would simply be solved if you just made people put their names on it. So much of what goes on in tax havens are these, shady companies and trusts and all these bizarre Byzantine structures, and that no one has any idea who owns any of it or where the money is coming from or where the money is going. And even when authorities are chasing, like they've got, warrants and they're going after the money, it's impossible for them to figure it out. And so one of the great things that has come as a result of the Panama Papers is this drive for transparency. And it's this idea, just put your name on it, put your name on it. So it started in England, it's gone over through Europe now. The United States last year introduced its own law to bring corporate transparency. Just put your name on the companies. And even, to everyone's shock, even Justin Trudeau made that promise right before the last election that in Canada, we are supposedly going to now have to put our names on companies. Sounds like a very simple thing. There's an incredible amount of pushback because it turns out people don't really want everyone to know what's going on in these places for the simple reason that we've seen in the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and the Pandora Papers and all these other leaks that are going to guaranteed continue to come over the next few years. And so I'm happy to sort of leave it there and say that any aspect of these kinds of stories, if you want to delve into further, I'd love to discuss them. But thank you again for having me, and I'm really happy that that these issues are all of a sudden on the public radar. You know, when I started on them, I had never even heard of half these tax havens, and now it seems to be my bailiwick. So here we are. Thank you again.
Okay, I think we're all getting spotlit now. So before we jump into any questions, thank you all. Those were 3 fantastic, really brief talks, but so rich in details. I see a lot of comments in the chat that folks are hoping to be able to watch this later or get transcripts. I understand it's being recorded, and this will be available afterwards. So rest assured, if there was a little tidbit that you heard and you didn't get a chance to write it down, you can go back and watch the recording. I want to first start with the panelists and just say, was there anything in any of each other's talks that you want to comment on, elaborate, or ask a question about before we turn to our audience and to some of the more prepared questions?
I just wanted to connect, Marco's point around those releases of those papers and that same step through that we see of the public attention and engagement with it. I think the release of the papers, had two impacts on people. One, they confirmed what people largely believed, which was that the rich were getting away without paying what they should pay, and it was a confirmation for what people felt like they already knew. But they also saw the rich get in trouble for it. And that was, up till then, there had been this belief that nothing would ever change, that they would never pay their fair share, and that the game was rigged and there was no way to unrig it. And so it opened up a conversation in the public and created a sense of hope that maybe there was a way to change this, and maybe we should be asking for this. Because before then, people really thought that, yeah, the system's unfair, but that's just the way it is.
Maybe if I can, well, first of all, I wanted to thank Marco and Katrina for the for all the terrific work that they've done in this area. I mean, the Pandora Papers got a lot of publicity after a number of other leaks as well, but it got a tremendous amount of publicity for reasons that Katrina mentioned as well. But also, this one also, I think, brought to the light a little bit more that these tax havens aren't rogue states outside. A lot of the tax havens, so many of them, are actually British protectorates, so they're really extensions of our financial system and of our elite. And this latest leak kind of brought that out by also talking about the tax havens that we have inside it. So they are us as well. We've allowed them. A lot of the tax havens were kind of created by our banks and by former finance ministers and others. So they're part of our system, and we've created them. They're not like the other, which has often been seen in that way.
Yeah, one of the themes that I feel like. Well, sorry, Marco, did you want to say anything first?
Oh no, go ahead.
One of the themes that kind of is percolating up, like the very fact that so many people are here tonight, the change in how we talk about taxes, and Katrina, your comment about COVID, I really do feel like, if we transported ourselves back to, April 2020, when we all thought, okay, well, we're almost done. Like, we just got a few more weeks of this pandemic. There was still very much a sense of we're in it together. We're helping elderly people get to grocery stores earlier in the morning. We're clapping for healthcare workers at 7 o'clock at night every day. And then very quickly, people realized we weren't all in this together. It's not the same experience. And in fact, some people are profiting excessively on the pandemic and are doing extraordinarily well. And that was the first time I felt like I heard really from people that, yes, things might be legal, it's perfectly fine to these are legal entities, these are legal businesses, but it's distasteful and it's immoral to be making so much money at the expense of others. And I think that's what I keep hearing, and I'm hoping you can comment a bit on that, around this new sense of, and how do we harness this new sense of, it's just wrong, even if it is legal. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw in the polling, we do a lot of polling on this sort of stuff because we're always curious what Canadians are thinking and want to, make sure we're checking our own echo chamber on this, frankly, because I think that's important to do. And the support for the wealth tax grew from 75% basically in late 2019 to 90% or 89% by August 2021. And that was driven largely by a sense of fairness. Because with that grew a sense that people felt the tax system was unfair, grew a sense of, concern around watching people barely get by in their lives, going from job to job. Healthcare workers, personal care workers, going from job to job. On one part of the newspaper, you see that story next to another story that talks about, sort of, above average profit margins for a series of businesses that have made out like gangbusters during the pandemic. So it was very stark, right? The who was hurting and who was, basically actually profiting was very, very stark during the pandemic. And I think it really drove people towards that support around fairness. Canadians ultimately are a fair bunch of folk, right? They like to believe that we have a fair and equitable society, and it became really clear that we didn't.
Mm-hmm. There's a great question that just came up in the chat a couple up ago. I'll read it out. Who is this from? This is from Kathy Orlando, and she's asking, which tax reform policy has the potential for traction in this parliament to be enacted? Tax haven rules, changes to inheritance tax laws, or the wealth tax? And I put that to all three of you.
Well, certainly there's immediate traction on the tax haven, and I think that the latest Pandora leaks has demonstrated that. There are a number of different elements of that. Somebody also in the chat raised a question about the 15% minimum tax. Now that's part of this OECD package, and the 50. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the 15%. That's just supposed to apply to the foreign profits of multinational corporations. But then there was also another element that just came out last week on basically replacing digital services tax with its allocation of the profit of multinational corporations. So that's some things. In terms of the other tax haven laws, there's whether we allow certain loopholes to continue. There's the treaties that we've got with a whole lot of countries. I mean, over the past decade, conservative and liberal governments signed all these tax agreements and tax treaties with all these countries that were like very blatant tax havens. And that allowed people, as Marco had mentioned, to have trusts or bring back income from those countries, basically tax-free. So I think that there's a lot of potential there. In terms of inheritance or wealth tax, it's been fantastic that the NDP has made this into a big issue. The Liberals last year in their throne speech promised to explore ways of taxing extreme wealth. Now, the only thing that they kind of mentioned doing on this was bringing in the luxury tax. That doesn't come close to it, but there seems to be an opening there. So I think that there's potential for traction. It's a minority government. It depends what the minority partners want to do on this. And it's been great to see Jagmeet Singh really mention fair taxes as a condition for cooperation in the parliament as well.
If I could jump in here, one of the things we found really interesting, looking at tax havens over the last 5 or 6 years, is this commingling of legitimate and illegitimate activity. And of course, it's difficult to parse it apart, but that is really what goes on in these tax havens. Besides Nike and Starbucks and Brookfield, you're going to have like the most stereotypical like 80s Panamanian drug dealers, or organized crime, or what have you. And it's all like literally they go to the same companies, they own the same shell companies, they probably take the same little hop flights over there and stay in the same hotels. It's unbelievable, this commingling of that legit and illegit. And we always think from a storyteller's perspective, from a journalist perspective, like, how do we parse these apart? And how do we tell the story of both of these going on at the same time without kind of unfairly impinging one side with what's going on in the other? Because they're really there for totally different reasons. They just both happen to find what they're looking for in the same place. And so one of the things we've really found that's so interesting is that the sexiest stories are obviously the blatant criminality, right? If you can find the absolute outright, fraud, scammers, money laundering, that kind of stuff are the greatest stories. They're hard to find. They're needles in haystacks, but they come out every once in a while. But what they do is they highlight what you can get away with in these places. And the thought is always, of course, you're not going to find them all, but if you can tell one of these sort of great, egregious, law-breaking stories, it highlights and it brings to the fore in the sort of public consciousness the kind of cowboy mentality that can and the anything goes mentality that goes on down in these tax havens. And that's when you kind of can bring in these discussions of fairness and of, well, should we really allow companies to set up foreign subsidiaries and just so that they don't have to pay any tax in Canada? Do we think that that should be illegal? Because that's kind of the same thing that these drug dealers are doing, just for different purposes. They're setting up subsidiaries so that they don't have to say where they got their money from. And so it's really interesting to think about, some of the reforms, obviously, for the purposes of tonight's discussion, are always based around fairness and things like that. But when we speak often to insiders in the government who, are constantly banging their heads against the wall with tax havens, they often say it's the law enforcement part. It's the law enforcement part that is lacking in Canada. And, the cops will tell you, back in the 90s, we had these specialized groups and we could go to any tax haven and track down any criminal. And all those groups were disbanded. Like the RCMP doesn't even have like a overseas money laundering group anymore. And so when they do one of these investigations, it's like grabbing a bunch of cops. No one knows anything about this. And it's kind of a specialty thing. And so what's really interesting is we look back on 6 years since the Panama Papers, not one charge laid, not one conviction, nothing. We're like the only country in the world where this doesn't happen. In the United States, they had huge high-profile trials, threw guys in jail. The Prime Minister of Pakistan is literally in jail right now because of the Panama Papers. And in Canada, not one charge laid. So, I know that criminality and tax fairness are kind of two separate things, but they do run in parallel. And we do have to ask ourselves in Canada, why is it that we're the only country that can't lay a charge or throw someone in jail for doing this?
I think we've got to get Katrina in on this nation's piece.
This is all great. What Toby and Marco have said have been excellent. I think that one of the ways, in fact, that we'll see this minority parliament act aggressively on a variety of issues, wealth taxation, increasing the income tax rates on high incomes, high corporate profit, closing down tax havens, is actually by showing that we're falling behind. 4 years ago, we would have been ahead of the game. And now we're quickly getting passed by a number of European countries. We're quickly getting passed by the US. President Biden's moving ahead on a number of tax mechanisms in order to increase the level of taxation and shut down the tax loopholes and shut down the tax havens. And so really, the minority parliament may do it sheerly out of embarrassment. The fact that we consider ourselves to, be kind of on the top of the fairness pile, and we're sinking down towards the bottom. And I think that that's actually critical for folks to understand and to start talking about is, where does Canada want its place in the conversation around fair taxation, both in this country but globally? Do we want to be a leader, or do we want to be dragged kicking and screaming to the floor to accept the very, very bare minimum on something like the global corporate tax rate or any of the other measures that we've been talking about? And so I think that's a question that, as an activist and an advocate, joining with other activists and advocates, I think we really need to put to the public, and we need to put to the government that's sitting for us, because I think there's a lot of people in that government, and I think across all the parties. I mentioned that stat before of 9 in 10 Canadians wanting a wealth tax. Well, 8 in 10 Conservatives want a wealth tax. So it's right across the party lines. This isn't just a bunch of lefties here who are saying, give us a wealth tax. It's everyone, because everyone sees the unfairness of it. And so I think that part of the conversation is shining a light on the inaction of our government in comparison to other governments that are acting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a bit, this is an NDP event, so I'm just going to go there. The NDP has been a long-time champion for tax fairness and income equality. Last November, introducing on Opposition Day a motion to implement a 1% 1% tax on wealth over $20 million and an excess profit tax on big corporations profiting from the pandemic. As everyone here knows, the motion was defeated 292 to 27. With the Liberals, the Bloc, and Conservatives all voting against it. I'm curious, if anyone here has a crystal ball. A couple of thoughts. One, in the chat, as well as I've heard from folks on doorsteps, they didn't think 1% was aggressive enough. So I'm curious what you think on that. And second, what's in your crystal ball? Do you think that if the NDP goes back again, that we'll see more folks falling in line and supporting this kind of legislation? Maybe we'll start with Toby again.
Yeah, I mean, we proposed a more progressive wealth tax rate, one starting at 1% for wealth over 10 million, 2% for over 100 million, and 3% for over $1 billion. And certainly I think they could be more aggressive. I mean, it will be a minority government, so even getting a wealth, I mean, there's some sense to a wealth tax of 1%, because the average property tax rates work out to close to about 1%. I think it's 0.85 across the country. It varies across the country, but it works out to about 1%. So we actually do have, as Robert Reich had said, we actually do have a wealth tax in Canada, but it's a relatively regressive wealth tax in that way. So I mean, it would be fantastic to get to get that wealth tax. We'll propose a bigger one, but if the NDP was able to get a 1% one with the Liberals, that would be great. The Bloc Québécois also proposed one, but they also only proposed one for 3 years. So I certainly don't have a crystal ball. I mean, it really depends on public pressure and political bargaining and political backbone on these issues in those. Yeah.
Katrina, what's your crystal ball telling you?
My crystal ball. This is not an issue that's going away. It's just going to grow, and it's going to be brought to. I mean, the NDP, no doubt, has led the charge on this, and I think to great effect, frankly. Yeah. And their wealth tax proposal this time around was more progressive, frankly, than the 2019 proposal. So we're seeing the NDP shift and break more ground around the issue of fair taxation, put more measures out there for consideration. And I think other parties, again, are going to have to play catch up to this. I mean, ultimately, the rubber's going to hit the road. We have this deficit that is going to continue growing. And yeah, there's lots of deficit financing that we can do. We got lots of debt room. Like, I will not deficit fearmonger here, and nor should anyone, frankly, because we're not in that place yet. But at some point, we're going to have a conversation about how to pay for that while still wanting the Canada we want. And I don't think that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals are going to want to be the architects of an austerity agenda. And so they're going to need to look towards these measures that the NDP have been talking about, and now that the Bloc and the Greens are talking about, and be really considerate of how they put these in. And they can't do, just little teeny luxury taxes and a partial closure on the stock options loophole. It doesn't give them enough money, right? So they're going to need to bring about very bold tax measures, or they're going to have to face being the architects of an austerity agenda. I don't see how they end up any other place.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Marco?
Well, one of the interesting things I think that hasn't come up yet, but that it's something that kind of circles around this issue a lot, and I think it's relevant in this context, is the housing issue. And I think that when we think about this, as Toby's been describing over the last, as well as Katrina's describing over the last 10 years about how this issue went from fringe to pretty mainstream, I feel like it's kind of accompanied a generational turnover. And this is a generational turnover where a generation is coming of age, especially in the major Canadian city centers, where, like Toronto-Danforth here, where they are convinced they will never, ever, ever buy property. And that really brings home the concept that society is divided into haves and have-nots. Those who have a place to live and those who will never have a place to live. And I think that is a very visceral and widespread feeling amongst an entire generation of Canadians coming up. And I know it's like how to solve the housing issue cracks open a whole new, policy areas. But from the point of view of, I think it is sort of viscerally related to this idea of tax fairness, that people who are stuck on the outside of I'm never going to get a house, are really concerned with, well, why did some people who are 4 years older than me end up getting a house, and now they've got their property tax exemption and they'll never have to pay tax on that thing, even as it goes up 18, 20, 30% a year. And I'm stuck renting, and there's nothing I can do. So I do think that there is, as Katrina said, this is not an issue that's going to go away. And I think as the have-not generation grows into maturity and takes up a bigger and bigger place in Canadian society, I think those kinds of demands for fairness are going to only become stronger.
And especially when, principal residences you don't have to make capital gains on, and any secondary real estate residence or any other investments, you only pay half the tax rate on, which is incredibly unfair. I mean, even people like Bill Gates have said that, and some of the wealthiest people in the world have said that we should be taxing capital at the same rate as labor. I mean, we've been through decades in which labor, the work, the actual work that workers do, that people sweat, every day to do, gets taxed at twice the rate, or that people pay on their investments, which is incredibly unfair. And it's been fantastic that the NDP has called for increasing the capital gains rate. I mean, I think it should be at 100% and with some adjustment for inflation. But to have it at 75%, I think that's really important as well. And that is connected to what Marco was talking about, the basic unfairness of that, demographic unfairness of that, and it's magnified by unfair tax policies there as well.
Mm-hmm. One piece we haven't talked about too much has been, and Marco, you talked about this a little bit with the RCMP, but just the general gutting to the governmental teeth to go after the tax evaders, to go after tax evasions and the just illegality or stemming from the CRA's cuts under Harper during the Harper era, and that the Liberals have returned some funding, but very little to the CRA. What do you think, what capacity is there within our existing government institutions to actually go after these corporations, go after these wealthy individuals, track them down and make them pay?
I can deal with it. This is a kind of a journalisty question. I sort of made notes about this and I wasn't sure if I was going to bring it up, but one of the really incredible things that I've sort of found over years of interviewing people who know this stuff inside and out is that when you actually read the tax code, no one ever really does. It's incredibly complex, et cetera, but there are teeth in there. We have Canadian tax law isn't toothless. It's there. And yet, when push comes to shove, tax court rarely actually, when the CRA goes way out on a limb and they're going to actually stick it to somebody who's really abusing it. The two big examples recently are Cameco and Loblaws. Loblaws had this like offshore bank, and it was, I don't remember the details of the case, but I do remember this. The CRA lost. The CRA lost in court on both those cases, and they're under appeal and things. But when the CRA spent like millions and millions of dollars and years and years and years and dozens or hundreds of people to investigate these cases, and they really wanted to make an example of this egregious abuse of the tax code, took it to court and lost. And so, when we get into why, a lot of it isn't really the law itself. It's the sort of jurisprudence. How are we applying the law? And there's, to get really wonky, there's this part of the tax code that's called the general anti-avoidance principle. And it's kind of like the escape valve for an auditor. When they can't really show that you broke that law or that provision, you just say, the general anti-avoidance principle, which is like, you can't just do something to get out of taxes. There's got to be kind of a legitimate business reason for doing this stuff. And no one has ever actually gotten busted on the general anti-avoidance principle. It's unbelievable. We have a blanket law that says you can't just abuse the system, and no one's ever been busted on it. And you wonder.
No, I agree that the tax court has generally ruled in a very conservative and narrow way. But I would say that that's evidence that we need to strengthen the rules and tell the tax court that we need stronger general anti-avoidance rules and actually change the laws there as well. There's also been evidence that the CRA has been much tougher on ordinary Canadians and small businesses than they have on the wealthy and larger corporations. This came out in a general report. It's come out in a whole lot of different areas. Now, I don't think that this is a reflection of the workers there. Often when I talk to the workers, they say, we want to be more aggressive, right? And the Isle of Man scam, there are all these out of court settlements with the wealthy people who took advantage of them, and nothing was done to KPMG and the other promoters, the lawyers or the promoters of these scams. They were the people who were pushing this, and so that's because they're well connected. So more money has gone into it, but the government needs to be much tougher, and I think that the government just hasn't had the backbone on this. Just another thing that I'd like to talk about is before it's over is the other end. We've been talking about the top. The wealthy and the corporations, but our tax system can also be used to increase equality at the bottom end too. And we've shifted our social welfare system much more to be delivered through the tax system. So instead of writing checks, there are often people get credits in that way. But that doesn't work unless people file their taxes, and a lot of people don't file their taxes. So something that we've been pushing for is automatic tax filing. So the government will do your taxes for you, but it's been fought against by the tax preparation industry, which makes a lot of money, is very profitable, and it's the most vulnerable that can make the most and for whom these dollars mean the most. I saw that there was a question there about basic income and the cost of that. That's got to go together with a delivery system like that as well. So sorry about taking on to another topic, but I do think that we need to talk about the positive ways that the tax system can be used in that way as well.
Absolutely. Katrina, did you want to jump in?
just to say that, again, in the polling, what we do see is that, there is still a very prevalent sense that, if we change the tax system, the rich will still try to dodge the taxes. And so enforcement is incredibly important. And I think that, every time, I really appreciate all the work on all the leaks, Marco. I really, really do. But every time there's a part of me that cringes a bit because I see the disenchantment that happens amongst the Canadian public in feeling like the game is rigged. And I think that there needs to be a very robust conversation, a very public conversation, a very daylighted conversation about what we have to do to unrig the game. What kind of enforcement measures are needed? What is the mandate that CRA needs to be given in very explicit and transparent terms so that they understand that their directive is to go after the rich tax cheats and not the smaller fish, so to say, who probably have made unintentional mistakes on their tax returns. I think that's a critical part of this too.
There was another question up, and I think it's worth fleshing out a little bit. If we could just talk a little bit, because you three are such experts in taxes, what would actually mean to implement a wealth tax? What are some of the nuts and bolts of that? Because this is not what the rest of us are living and breathing every day.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the wealth at the very top is our shares and our shares in companies, right? And if they're publicly listed companies, you can get the real-time wealth. I mean, we track Forbes does this real-time wealth. So does Bloomberg. You can find out an estimate of somebody's wealth from minute to minute. So for a lot of people who are concerned about what the valuation would be, it could actually be one of the easiest taxes to collect in that way. Because their wealth, at least in public corporations, is public information, and once a public registry comes in, as Marco was talking, a public registry of the real owners of companies, will know much more about what the private wealth is in those ways. And now there are some questions about how you value it if it's not traded on the market, but there are ways that people have discussed about how you can come to fairly accurate valuations of that. Now, there are other factors in wealth. I mean, houses are a big one. Art might be a significant one for some people, and there may be ways to avoid it in some different ways. But there are ways to avoid all taxes. I mean, every tax, there are forms of avoidance, and there are measures that come out. But for a wealth tax, it would actually be one of the easiest ones. The wealth tax on high levels of wealth would actually be one of the easiest ones to collect in that way.
Certainly makes it sound like a no-brainer. Okay, so we are approaching the last 10 minutes of the session. We're going to try to get folks from the crowd to be able to ask questions. There's been a lot of chatter in the chat, some questions, some comments, sometimes folks answering each other's questions. Hopefully, folks know how to use the hand up function, and I'm going to try really hard to keep it short and get a few people being able to ask their questions and being actually speak on camera or on screen. So if you have a question you haven't had a chance to ask, or you haven't heard said out loud, or you wanted to ask, please put your hand up, not physically, but like in the reactions button, and we will find you. All right, so the first hand I see is Kathy Orlando. I'm going to unmute you. You are unmuted, and I think your camera is on. Wait.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Hi, Kathy.
Great. Oh, this was excellent. I'm from Citizens Climate Lobby, and certainly been following the work that you all have been doing. And I'm just off the top of my head trying to imagine all the groups that support tax reform. I mean, So I think of Greenpeace, the Broadbent Institute. Can you think of any others while we're here? Because I think there's a potential for synergy.
Oh, there's tons. I mean, Oxfam Canada, has jumped into that. Lead Now, Acorn actually has a specific campaign around a specific tax loophole, but supports the overall agenda of taxing the rich that's put forward by at least our campaign. What I would suggest you do is, go on the letstaxtherich.ca website, because there's 30 organizations that are listed there, from large to small. So it is the Greenpeace of the world, but it's also, the South Asian Community Association in Toronto. It's a number of different organizations, very diverse in their interests, who recognize, I think what your organization recognizes, that this is a key element of their work and what they're calling for.
Thank you, Katrina. Was there, just to keep it short, I'm not going to get the other speakers to comment, is there any other hands up from the audience? I see thumbs up. Richard Lockhead, I think I said that right. I hope so. I'm going to unmute. I don't know how to get you to unmute. Are you able to unmute yourself? There you go. Thank you, Richard.
There we go. Okay, thank you. Great session. Learned a lot. Every time an election, conservative politicians will say, working people pay more taxes, and we're going to put more money in your pocket by cutting taxes. But is it possibly true that working people do pay more taxes because most of their wealth is from their own labor rather than from investments, and they don't have the means to really find tax breaks?
If I can jump in there was a really good study. We're hoping to update it by Mark Lee at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives a number of years ago, that looked at all the different taxes. And Robert Reich kind of brought this up in his video. Often people will say, oh, the wealthy, the top 1% pays, such and such percent of the tax. But they're generally always talking just about the income tax system. If you look at all the taxes, at payroll taxes, sales taxes, corporate taxes, and look at the incidence of that, how it affects all different households and individuals. The study by Mark Lee found that the top 1% actually pay a lower rate of overall tax than all other income groups did in Canada, including the poorest 10%. And yes, the highest ratio was paid by the middle class in that way, or middle income groups. Now, it was interesting. Mark did this study a number of years ago, and since then, in the past 5 years, I've seen similar studies done in the UK and then also in the US, finding the same sort of thing, looking at that incidence. So it's not just in Canada. It's also in other countries. And then if you get at the effective, Marco and others have done such great work bringing out, looking at money that's sheltered in tax havens. Often that isn't part of these statistics because that's money that's hidden in that way. So what you said is accurate, is correct on that.
Okay, we have just a few last minutes. Do we have one last question from the crowd? I see, Mike, I see a physical hand up. So we're gonna go for it. Physical hand.
Okay, can you hear me? All right. So we're all on board for policy. We're all interested in policy, wealth taxes, international tax avoidance, etc. We're all participating in this from a policy level per se. I'm interested in appealing to people that don't think a lot about policy. So in my discussion with our candidates here in Ottawa, NDP candidate, I suggested an image of a group of people sitting at a restaurant table. The bill comes from the waitress and the rich people dash off, leaving the bill to be paid by the middle class. Because we're talking about more programs we could have in the future with more revenue, et cetera, et cetera. We have bills to pay right now. It's the middle class, the legitimate salary earner, the wage earner. They get paid every second Wednesday, every second. They don't have a tax avoidance strategy. They're stuck paying, right? We have a very grassroots problem, which needs to be addressed from the opposite direction, or needs to be discussed about, which is the implications to the middle class of the wealthy not paying their tax, of these massive corporate tax cuts over the years. What does it mean to people? Here in Ottawa, it means if I want to go to a picnic in Vincent Massey Park, I have to pay to park now, right? That funds somebody's tax cut. Or you want to go to Gatineau Park or anything, there's all these fees that have come in. So I'm simply urging all the intellectual people and the policy people on the panel to just reverse it and sell it to people on their own terms, right? Which is to say there is a bill for all the present social programs, all the critical needs that we have. That bill is being paid right now, but it's being paid by the middle class, not by the people with the most money. As Toby was just addressing, it looks like the upper end earners are actually paying a lower percentage. So I'm simply urging people to change look at through the telescope from the other end for a change, and simply go to the ramifications of this unraveling of the fairness in our tax system over the last 30 years, corporate tax cuts, capital gains tax, all these ridiculous loopholes that only the wealthy can access. What does it mean to the average working woman or average working man? It means you pay the tax bill of the billionaire. And that's a very visceral, I think it's fair and honest, but I think it's a very visceral way of communicating and accelerating the need to address these problems. Thank you very much.
And if I can just add to that, there's a fantastic group of young activists called Resource Movement, children from wealthy families who are really strong advocates for wealth taxes, estate taxes, and a lot of progressive policies on that, and a group of patriotic millionaires. So often and increasingly, we've got some of the wealthiest who are saying, please tax us more. Not all of them, certainly, but a lot of them are saying, tax us more. The laws are unfair. So, it boggles the mind to a certain extent that governments are not doing this if they are calling for this.
I do want to bring in one other comment before we wrap up. And this is just, we are fortunate that in our 100 and so people in our audience tonight, we actually have a participant who works at the CRA and did want to just make one quick clarification about some of the CRA cases that going after, tax evasions and stuff. So I'm going to call on Paul to just jump in briefly. If you can unmute yourself.
Hi. No, Mark, you made one comment that was incorrect about the GAR cases. There actually been hundreds of GAR cases that have gone to court. And once they go to court, CRA actually wins 50% of the GAR cases. There might be a question of whether, more cases could be using the GAR. That's another question. But as far as the ones that go to court, we do. CRA does win quite a few of them. It's complicated. It takes a long time to get them there. And we have the best lawyers in the city and across the country that oppose anytime you use the GAR. But we do win those.
And then the federal government has promised to strengthen GAR as well.
Yeah,
we want to win more than 50 or whatever percent. Too.
Right. We don't have a business purpose test, which Australia has, and I think the US has. That's one thing where they could improve the GAR.
Oh,
thank you for bringing that up. I'm of course only really aware of these big cases that have been sort of the caught the headlines, and
right.
I'm not sitting in tax court looking at every docket. So no, I think it's important to bring that up. Thank you for that clarification.
We actually won Loblaws at the tax court, but lost at the federal court of appeal. It's now at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's appeal.
And I just think it's so great that we that these Cinema Politica events do such a phenomenal job of attracting great talent to speak and share their time, but also an amazing audience of such informed folks who can challenge the speakers and the moderator, could go toe to toe just as well. And if we could have a panel of 115 people, I think we'd have an even richer conversation. I think it is 9 o'clock. We do need to wrap it up. It has been so fantastic. It's been such an honor moderating this session tonight. A huge thank you to everyone behind the scenes who made this happen. I think I need to jump over to Jean, who's going to close us out.
Well, again, yes, and let me second everything that you're saying, Claire, and for yourself and for Toby and Katrina and Marco. Thank you so much for taking the time to make these wonderful presentations to us and clarify some of these things. And it certainly got me riled up. I'm ready to march in the streets to storm the barracks here about some of these injustices that we're all suffering. Sorry to a few of you that I see that maybe are like me, not so Zoom savvy, and we're using your real hands rather than your reaction hand. So we'll have to, maybe we can do one of these events on just how to use Zoom. Anyway, again, do the three panelists have any final little short statements they'd like to make before we wind up? Very short.
I just say I am a fan of my panelists. I'm with Marco, Toby. Your work is amazing. It fuels my work. Seriously, I base almost all the things that we say and communicate off of the research that the two of you do and some other really great researchers out there. Without the investigative reporting and without the policy, we don't have what we need to communicate and make this meaningful in people's lives. So I know sometimes policy sometimes seems dry, but it actually is a critical element of this. And, Toby, for those of you who want to dig deeper, Toby has put together a really great piece that shows how we could put, $50 billion back into the coffers every year if we decided to institute a number of tax measures. Plug Toby there.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Katrina has been fantastic, and in terms of mobilizing on these issues and mobilizing more people and groups and everything else. But it's the public pressure that really causes change on this, and so public and political pressure. It's the NDP has been fantastic on these issues. So many things would not be there on the landscape without the NDP, but you got to just keep on pressuring politicians on these issues if we want change to occur. The battle won't ever be won, I wish I could say it would be, but it's a continual pressure, a fight, because it's people against those with a lot of money, and there's more of us, but they've got a lot of money, so we need to get people out there and push and campaign and sign up for some of the things that the Broadbent Institute has done. Sign up on our website. We don't harass people all that much, but we do e-actions, and I think that can really be effective.
Well, now I was just going to jump in and say as well, thank you so much. I've had the pleasure of being able to speak to my co-panelists in the past, and a journalist is only as good as their sources, and now, unfortunately, all my best sources are just speaking out in public, and I'm not going to be able to, pretend that this scoop is mine. So I thank you so much for speaking to me over the last years, and I hope these conversations continue going forward. And it's really exciting to see how something so fringe is now so central. It really does give you a sense of momentum, and events like this really do help. So thank you everyone for coming out and letting us draw on about boring tax stuff.
And thanks very much, Claire, and to your daughter, who was fantastic.
Thank you. Oh, Jean, you're on mute.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.